So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the seminar series organized by the Ateneo de Manila University, Department of Economics, and the Ateneo Center for Economic Research and Development. I'm Jemmy Lonto from the Department of Economics, and I will be the moderator for this morning's session. So in terms of our house rules, we will let the speaker finish his presentation first before we entertain questions. For the Zoom participants, kindly stay on mute and stop sharing your video during the duration of the presentation. During the Q&A, please virtually raise your hand and wait to be acknowledged. You may unmute and show yourself when asking your question. To our participants joining us in Facebook, please post your question in the comment section. Slides, videos, and other materials from the seminar are posted on our website only when the speaker gives his consent for sharing them. So our speaker for this morning is Professor of Economics at the Ateneo de Manila University. He has a PhD in Economics degree from the University of the Philippines School of Economics and did postdoctoral studies at Yale University Economic Growth Center. He has published books and journal articles internationally and locally, and he specializes in trade, labor, and development economics. So to talk about monopsony in Philippine labor markets and its implications on gender discrimination, let us all welcome our speaker for this morning, Dr. Leonardo M. Lanzona, Jr., Professor of the Ateneo de Manila University. I now give the virtual floor to Sir Butch.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Let me first put my presentation on the screen. Before I begin, I would like to indicate that the research that I have right now is still very much work in progress. No? Although I've worked on these issues for many years already since I started with my project in USAID under the Respond. But this current research that I'm doing is being funded by the University Research Council under the RCW program. Okay. The outline of the presentation is as follows. So first I have an introduction, and then I talk a little bit about the way I estimate wages, more or less the so-called empirical framework. And then I talk about the empirical strategy, and then after that, I'll talk about the data itself and the results of the empirical analysis. And then finally, I will conclude and provide the so-called policy directions. Okay, introduction. So monopsony is a source of market power and discrimination. The term was first coined by Joan Robinson, who noted that firms can profit from gender bias. Employers can actually reduce wages for workers if wage elasticity to labor supply is quite low. Later, it was developed as the so-called company town argument, that if you have only one company in a town, then chances are you have only one employer. But later, it was modified to allow the so-called presence of industry concentration that could result in monopoly as well. Now, recently, there's been more interest in the theory, and the modern view would combine the literature of search with the heterogeneity of worker preferences. No? Firms are presumably able to sort out workers by offering specific wages and amenities to workers who are willing to take the job at reduced wages. Workers are forced to accept these offers because of idiosyncratic preferences as well as high cost of search. According to the theory of labor contracts, labor arrangements can be categorized into two. You have the so-called fixed wage arrangements with periodic renewals. And then you have what we call state contingent contracts with implicit or informal contracts. No? when we say state contingent, it means that your wages would depend on the state of the economy. So if the state of the economy is bad, your wages are reduced. But if it's okay, then employers can increase your wages. But if it's bad, you're still given some kind of insurance. No? So from the literature, these are the kinds of arrangements that can potentially lead to a competitive equilibrium. No? Holstrom, however, points out that unlike state contingent contracts, which are unsustainable, fixed wage contracts are more able to guarantee a socially optimal nominal wage, which can be adjusted at the firm's discretion, as long as you're able to satisfy the worker participation constraints and incentive compatibility. You know? Nevertheless, Gordon first argued that this kind of contracts, the fixed wage contracts, may cause firms to offer wages at a lower level, claiming lower marginal product. And with costly labor mobility, this may be possible as the opportunity cost to the firms in terms of firms leaving their companies would tend to be low, no? If you have a very high worker mobility, very high cost of labor worker mobility. Now, monopsony has recently been noted and been measured in many developed countries. But this seems to be a more serious case in the Philippines, given the limited options faced by the workers because of industrial concentration and also because of job polarization. It's very difficult for uneducated workers, for instance, to go into certain types of activities and occupations. Moreover, fragile institutions also fail to provide support to the labor sector, where labor representation in the form of unions is weakened. So in general, that seems to be affecting everybody. But for women, the higher subjective valuation that women place on household activities creates an even greater constraint in accepting job options. No? So if wage offers are accepted, if this would mean that it's consistent with their other priorities, such as lower transportation costs, flexible time, and proximity to the house. So if the other priorities are not given to them, are not satisfied, it's unlikely that they will move to another job or accept any offer. Now, to measure market power, the wage elasticity of hours work is calculated. No? There, however, exists an empirical issue, since the observed wages would be correlated with the error term of the hours worked. So according to labor contract theory, reported wages are determined by wage offers and contracts chosen by the workers. So the reported wages may indicate self-selection. So to address this empirical issue, the paper uses a version of the multinomial self-selection model, a version of the multinomial self-selection models, using contract choice as a dependent variable. And this will solve two basic problems. First, it purges the observed wages of the error terms that may be correlated with the labor hours, and allows the predicted wages for labor arrangements, even when wages are not observed, no? Particularly in certain contracts. Some people are not paid. No? They engage in some kind of work. So this is what we call I call the alternative work arrangements. So finally, also for my introduction, I use pooled labor force surveys to be able to capture the variance of contracts. So at the individual levels, contracts may not change over time. So to be able to get a variance of the contracts, so I use the pooled labor force surveys, which of course have some disadvantages of its own, which we'll try to solve over in the paper. Okay, empirical model for estimating wages. No? So basically, the problem the monopsony in the monopsony literature is to determine the wages that will be used for estimating wage elasticity. So to be able to do that, to solve that problem, I start off with the Mincer wage equation, which measures wage returns of human capital investments such as education and training. Now, this model has been extended by Heckman, who noted that the reported wages may be self-selected, so the sample might be biased. So he created a self-selection model which tries to solve for this. And the assumption was that there were two options available to the workers: either they don't work or they work, and therefore you observe wages. No? And then later this model was generalized by Lee, who took into account more than two options. So it's possible that the workers may have other options apart from just working and not working. So this would tend to be more realistic. However, this approach is similar to Heckman since it only uses a single sample selection control variable to, 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 to condition the so-called unobserved factors affecting wages. No? So in effect, the Lee model assumes independence of irrelevant alternatives, no? Where options are presumably independent of one another. So let's say when you migrate, that is independent of deciding whether to work or not. It's a totally separate kind of option that may not affect your decision to either work or not. No? So the problem there is that this might not be realistic. No? And since we are focusing on contracts, these contracts are substitutable. No? So the idea is that we cannot assume independence of irrelevant alternatives. Actually, initially, I tried to use the Lee model, and then I tested for independence of irrelevant, and apparently it's there now. I mean, it's not satisfied. So the contracts seem to be substitutable. So to solve that problem, I adopt the Bourguignon model, which uses the same number of control variables as the workers' options. No? So it's not just one sample selection control variable. So this makes it possible to conduct the empirical analysis even without assuming independence of irrelevant alternatives, since you're taking into account all the different options all at the same time. There's a lot of discussion of this model in the paper, but let me just focus on the last equation in that section where you have the wages here. So this is like the Mincer model, no? Except that so you have the education and training variables, as well as other possible structural factors that could affect wages. And then you have the selection control variables. No? So the M of Pj refers to the expectations of the probabilities of choosing a certain option J. And these are the selection control variables, which are calculated using the multinomial logic. So the coefficient attached to the selection controls represents the correlation between unobserved variables in the wage equation and the alternatives from the selection equation. So there may be certain unobserved variables that may be correlated to wages and the choice of the contract. So that is taken into account by the R. And then this correlation could be correlated this time to the wages. So in other words, what the coefficient is trying to do, the sigma times the R, it measures the effects of unobserved variables that resulted in a certain worker choosing a certain option, and that particular unobserved variable having some impact on the wages themselves. So the wages used in the regression later pertain to the wages under permanent labor contracts in order to predict wages of workers as if they were all engaged in permanent arrangements. And these wages should reflect the fixed wage arrangements in the markets based on the observables. Okay, now how do I measure the monopsony? It consists of three equations. So first, the Bourguignon model, so the multinomial logic. So I have the individual characteristics, I have regional controls, and then because I'm using pool data, so it runs across several years, I included certain time varying aggregate variables to take account of changes in the general economy, because contracts could be affected by that. At the same time, workers are also taking note of these things, if whether they should enter the labor market or not. At the same time, we try to, these variables also take into account income changes. So what we hope to do is to come up with the so-called, we try to control the income effects of wage factors. No? The so-called uncompensated labor supply model. So to some extent, the income effects can be controlled through these variables. I also included years to take into account the time trends. So there may be some unobservable variables that run across time that may not be accounted by the model. So with this equation, after doing this, I then work on the Mincer wage equation with the sample selection bias, no? That was derived from the previous test estimates. So I included industrial concentration as well in the Mincer equation, and then I interacted it with the year. No? So given that industrial concentration can be a key factor in terms of determining wages. Industrial concentration simply means these are the regions of Metro Manila, Central Luzon, and of course Calabarzon. No? So it would seem that people are migrating to these areas to find work. And then from there, I work on the labor hours equation. Using the model, the Mincer equation, I predicted the log wages, no? from the previous equations, and then I regressed it with the log Rs. So the wage elasticity is measured in terms of the B sub W. You might say that there might seem to be some circularity between the contract choice equation and the labor hours equation. Basically, you could say that they're the same choices, no? But I would assume that the contract choice estimates are based on simply on the workers' preferences and choices. No? The firms have nothing to do with that, with the choice. No? The firms cannot control the choice. No? So it's simply based on the decisions made by the workers. On the other hand, when you talk about labor hours, this is where firms could actually have some weight. They could, in a way, affect how much labor hours that you could work on. So the specification here is a bit different in the sense that I put in some capital variables here, such as the gross capital formation and Philippine inventories. Because given the capital inputs that are found in the economy, that could affect the amount of work, the amount of hours that workers may have. So that will take away the circularity problem that may be affected. So once I have the B sub W, I can now be able to measure the monopsony. No? So I suppose we're all familiar with this equation. This is the profit maximizing condition for a monopsony. And the idea is that there could be a variance between the wages that are being offered and the marginal revenue product of the worker, no? what he actually contributes to the revenue for the company. No? So if the BW is approaching infinity, that means that there's no monopsony, no? Very limited monopsony, and the wages are exactly equal to the marginal revenue product of labor. However, if the B sub W approaches zero, then that means that labor is wage inelastic. In other words, workers will accept any wage because they will not change their labor supply regardless of the wages. And if it's zero, if the B sub W is zero, it means that the labor supply is completely wage inelastic. So that would be a case of extreme monopsony. Okay, some descriptive statistics. So as I said already, to gather data on time-varying labor arrangements, I pulled the labor force surveys from 2010 to 2018. I took away the COVID years because that might change the story. And then to be able to come up with the labor arrangements using the labor force survey, I classified the contracts into three. No? So you have the permanent arrangements. So you have this data in the labor force survey. You have permanent employment and regular compensation. And then you have alternative work arrangements, which include self-employment or temporary work, no? With some records of hours of work. Sometimes they don't have records of wages, no? Of course, self-employment doesn't have any record of wages. And then, but for some, there might be some varying forms of compensation. A lot of them are actually below the minimum wages. So things of that sort. But for the regression in trying to measure the effect of, the wage elasticity, I simply use the wages found in permanent employment. And then the last category would be those people who did not report any wage or have no record of employment. Some of them might have actually been migrating. So I just left that in. So it's possible that they found some other activities that are more worthwhile. Okay, I hope you see this variable. No? So this distribution across the arrangements, and then I also controlled for schooling and age categories. So you will notice that most of the sample that I have are not really working, no? Or non-local market participant. No? They may be OFWs, and a lot of these people are actually women. No? So women seem to be, it's possible that they are more attached to their household activities, and that's the reason why they would not participate in the labor market. Now, for the alternative arrangements, that comes in as seems to be the most preferred one. No? There's a significant amount of the sample that are found in alternative work arrangements, but most of these are actually males, no? As opposed to females. So these are the self-employed temporary work arrangements, and most of them are actually males. No? So it would seem that the women are not quite attracted to this kind of arrangements. And then finally, permanent work arrangements constitute around 20% only. And it would seem that there seems to be an equal share between males and females. Males and females, yes. So, but notice that the female who enters this kind of arrangements are mostly highly educated. No? These are the highly educated individuals. So the idea is that educated women, in particular who want to work, would seem to prefer these permanent labor arrangements. Now, the data shows the following in terms of the reported wages and the hours of work. So, as I said, this may be affected by self-selection. No? So you will notice that permanent contracts provide higher wages. And it would seem that women are receiving higher wages, no? In these contracts. As I said, because these are mostly educated women, and some of them are experienced. No? So you have a lot of women engaged in these activities, and they tend to have a higher wage than the males. No? Now, in terms of hours of work, you will notice that there seems to be more hours of work for permanent arrangements because the alternative arrangements tend to be more flexible. These are hours of work per week. No? So there seems to be greater flexibility in terms of work hours for alternative arrangements and for permanent arrangements. Okay. Okay, these are the variables that I will be using, and I compare them over time. No? The first part here would be from 2010 to 2014, and then the other part would be from 2015 to 2018. So you will notice that the movement from here to here, from the first period to the second period, it seems to be greater. And so that implies that there seems to be more permanent arrangements that are being done. So in fact, as shown here, in terms of percentages, from 19, but there also seems to be more unemployment. No? I mean, in terms of the local participation, there seems to be greater, but over time, the arrangements, the alternative arrangements seem to have gotten lower. Hours of work have also increased because contracts are inclined now to be more permanent, and daily wages are also a little bit higher. And you will also notice that for the macro variables, I use direct investments and trade values, and the sum of exports and imports. I use this because it seems to be more exogenous, right? The government has very limited control over this. Because if it becomes exogenous, it might create certain problems because it's possible that it might be decided on by the employment problem. But if it's foreign trade or real trade, a lot of it may come from world conditions, no? from the global economy. And then I also use, as I said, no, for the labor hours, I use gross capital formation and real inventories. And it would seem that when you move from the first period to the second period, there seems to be a lot of economic activity. No? There seems to be some kind of improvement in economic performance. So essentially, there's also a lot of GDP increases in the second period. Okay, so these are my regression results already. So you will notice that years of schooling, years of schooling apparently has a negative effect. But if you square it, it's going to increase. No? The amount of work, especially in permanent arrangements, seems to be increasing. This is consistent with the findings that the educational system is not really responding to the labor market needs. No? And most of the people who are working are job polarization stories that most people who are working are really the educated individuals. Experience are expected, and then well, I have all of these different variables, but you will notice that when you interact, I use some interaction terms. No? When you interact industrial dummies with the years, the males seem to be responding a lot. No? They seem to be the base outcome here is not working. No? So that means that if the coefficient is negative, you would engage in alternative activities rather than not working, or you will engage in permanent arrangements rather than not working. So in terms of movements in the industrial regions over time, it seems that the males are quite active. But if you look at the female, there seems to be no response. No? In fact, if you look at the variables here, there seem to be less significant results for the women. So most of the decisions in terms of participating in work come from personal characteristics. No? While males seem to be more adapting a little bit more, although the signs seem to be showing that in certain cases, like for instance, in the case of trade, no? They would actually, well, if you look at trade, there seems to be very limited activity, although there's more alternative arrangements for the males, no? But for the females, actually trade results in lesser work activities. No? So it would seem that our trade, which is somehow dependent on imports and less on labor, then increasing trade, given the way it has been set up right now, would seem to use less labor. But if you look at foreign direct investments, you will see positive signs for the women. So this actually confirms certain findings that there seems to be some complementarity between women's work and foreign direct investments. So basically, maybe because of foreign direct investments, there's more need for service activities. So women would tend to be engaged in those in that kind of work. Okay, now So using that equation, we now compute for the wages. No? So we have the expected signs, although you will notice that the returns of education for males are quite low, but the women are just okay. No? I mean, these are what you often see on the averages. Now, if you look at industrial dummies, the wages in the three regions that I mentioned, there seems to be higher wages, but over time it's declining. No? So the idea is that over time, the wages in these regions get to be lower and lower. Maybe it's because of the increasing foreign direct investments, increasing economic performance, that might be a little bit more capital intensive. Now, for the sample selection control, so you have negative signs for non-participation. So that means that those who do not participate would, if they do participate, would receive lower wages. No? So that's the reason why they're not participating in the first place. No? But for alternative arrangements, it's positive, no? Particularly for the males. So those people who participated in the alternative contracts would have certain unobserved characteristics that would result in higher wages for them. No? Okay. Now, in case of the permanent arrangements, it's positive for the males, but notice that it's negative for the females. No? So, of course, the model does not really explain what these things are. No? These are unobserved characteristics affecting your wages. So if you engage in permanent contracts, if you're a woman, you have certain unobserved characteristics that could result in lower wages for you. You know? A lot of this may be motivation or expertise and things of that sort. No? These are unobserved factors, but it's also likely that it may be due to discrimination, although we cannot say for sure. Because the sample, I mean, the selection controls are really black boxes that can mean a lot of things, but certainly some indication why there seems to be lower wages, no? For most of the women is because of these, I mean, some kind of reduction in wages when they engage in permanent arrangements. Okay. Okay, so I've now the last equation. I hope you can see it. So you will notice that it's less than one. The wage elasticity equation is less than one. So it's inelastic. So even the males are affected by the monopsony. Okay, partly because of industrial concentration, I suppose. But you will notice for the females, it's actually negative, but it's insignificant. So you cannot rule out that it's actually zero. No? So it's possible that the labor for women tend to be rather inelastic, and therefore the work once the employer sees that, he could actually offer a lower wage, knowing that the woman will continue to work even if the wages are low. Since it's not, the women tend to be less responsive to wage changes. The other variables which seem to show that capital is complementary to labor, and all the other things. I mean, these things seem to be consistent. The variables here seem to be consistent with the contract choice results that we had earlier. But the key result in this table is really this one, the difference between, although both of them are affected by monopsony, it would seem that the women are more affected by it. Maybe it's because they have to meet certain priorities. I mean, wages might not be the key reason why why they decide to work. No? Maybe it's because of close proximity to the house. So with the whatever additional income that they could get, as long as the work is closer to the house, they would probably accept it. No? Right. So that's the basic story why there seems to be some kind of wage discrimination, especially on the average, no, for the women. Okay, so I'll now conclude. I don't know how much time I have used up. I have 5 minutes left. So monopsony seems to affect both males and females. So as I said, it may be because of industrial concentration, the usual monopsony story. So if permanent arrangements are in demand, workers are forced to migrate to industrial regions, and the search cost of looking for other jobs may tend to be high. No? So this would be for both males and females. But another possible reason, particularly for the females, is that alternative work does not, which may offer flexibility, does not offer much in terms of wages. No? So they would probably accept the permanent contract with higher wages, although it might not be very flexible, no? Or it might not be. I mean, the wages that they'll be receiving might not be the same as the wages that the males are receiving in these kinds of arrangements. But because of the other priorities, and since they have no other alternative, since alternative contracts tend to be inferior, then they would just accept the permanent contract. So it's really a matter of finding options. So gender discrimination occurs when firms take advantage of the fact that women have other priorities apart from the wage, and that women often accept wages even below their marginal value to the production. Um, you might say that, well, the women accepted the wage, but the thing is, they'll be getting wages lower than what their male counterparts will be getting, no? For the same kind of work. But because they have been observed to have to be less responsive to the wages might be offered to them at a lower level. Okay, so some policy direction. So the usual solution to monopsony problems is the minimum wage. No? So this is standard recommended in the presence of monopsony. And I've done some studies on minimum wages, and I mentioned that, for very large firms, there's really a need for minimum wages. No? But care must be taken in implementing this policy, because this might be affecting also the smaller companies, no? And therefore their wage cost might be higher, and so they end up laying off their workers. So some care in terms of defining what these minimum wages are would be important, no? And then a complicating issue in the market is that maybe the wages, which are actually lower than what they should be receiving, may already be higher than the minimum wage, right? So that will have that the minimum wage policy would no longer be binding. No? So there might be a need for minimum wages, but it might not really solve the problem. No? Another policy would be to implement certain legal measures that can be imposed on firms that are found to practice market power. So that's where the Competitiveness Commission would come in. So this could be done by maybe strengthening workers' rights for information. So they need to know exactly how the firms, determine their wages and whether these wages are fair or not. Maybe we could also offer support for workers in the MSMEs to be able to provide alternative work activities. So if they're offered a certain wage, they will decide not to accept it because there might be other options, no? And then reduce these search costs. No? Social protection, especially unemployment insurance and other forms of assistance, would also be important in strengthening the options for the women particularly. No? And I guess the other workers as well. No? So the idea is that they could decide to not accept a certain offer because anyway there's some social protection that's being provided by the government. Also, maybe we could require career programs for women, provide them with progressive wages. In fact, the results show that women benefit more from the experience. So with more experience, so the idea is that maybe they could start at a low wage, but if there's a program that will clearly state how much they'll be getting if they stay in a company for a longer period, then that would give them more inputs for their decisions. And then strengthening worker representation in management, allowing unions to play a major role in decision making. And also the social protection may be for domestic work. No? So if women stay in the house, they could probably be offered some kind of conditional cash transfer, and maybe because they're doing an important activity for the household. Okay, I guess that's it. No? Okay, that's the end of my presentation.
So thank you very much, Sir Butch.
Okay.
And at this point of our program, so again, thank you very much, Sir Butch, for sharing with us the literature, your methodology, and also the findings related to your study about showing the relationship between monopsony in the Philippine labor markets and the implications with respect to gender discrimination. So at this part of the program, we will now open the floor for questions. So to our Zoom participants, two ways to ask. You can either raise your hand so that I can call you, acknowledge you, and then you can ask your question. And you can also type your question in the Zoom chat. And to our many participants joining us in Facebook, you can also type in your comments so that we can also have the chance to read them and ask them to Sir Butch. So for our first question, I'd like to call, I see that we have a raised hand. Can I ask Mr. Jesus Felipe to please kindly ask your question? Thank you. And also please state your institutional affiliation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very good morning, everyone. Butch, fantastic story, very, very nice. Really enjoyed. The problem with these stories is that one needs another 2 hours going into them. When you show tables 4 and 6, it's like more of a super interesting. Just a couple of comments, questions for you to elaborate. One of them is obviously the mystery of education, statistically significant variable. If you could elaborate a bit more, whether it's a question of really is a perennial issue in the Philippines that is being discussed. So a few more words will be very, very interesting. As you know, we have James Heckman coming in a couple of weeks to the Philippine Economic Society. So it would have been very interesting listening to you. The second question is underemployment. If you might have been a variable that you would like to control with here. Underemployment, as you know, we have very good statistics in the Philippines. Is a variable that is tracked. And finally, is a more generic question. I think, of course, what your paper, your study goes is to how wages are determined in the country, the story of industrial concentration, the role of the large firms and the conglomerates in particular. Of course, they are the ones really determining the wages, and the rest follows, which is the story goes above what you have said about gender discrimination. I think at the end of the day, the question that we need to ask in the Philippines is why are wages still so low? And this has to do with issues about, of course, it's a question of being a developing country, the structure of production of the Philippines, the type of products, etc., etc. But what is very interesting is that wages are, of course, determined by these conglomerates, but wages are substantially higher than in the rest of the country. So very interesting is why these companies pay substantially higher wages than what is going on in the rest of the country. Just some questions for you to
Yes, thank you.
But again, congratulations. Thank you. Excellent story.
Thank you, Jesus, for your comments. Yeah, actually, can I answer now, Jamie? Is that okay? Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
there's a lot of mystery about education. I agree with that, and therefore I could probably talk a little bit about that in the paper. Now, the issue of the underemployment, I think engaging in alternative work arrangements is a form of underemployment. So I could probably, I did discuss that in the paper, but I could probably mention that as well, no? Because this seems to be the major problem in the Philippines, the quality of work. No? And as I said, because of the quality of work in other activities are so low, they are then those women or males who want to find, higher compensating jobs would probably be forced to work in the conglomerates. No? So it's possible that they're their qualifications would actually mean that they should be getting higher wages, but because they have no choices, no? Their options are quite limited, and these firms probably know that already, no? So they may simply be basing their wages on the minimum wage. Parang they're sort of creating some kind of connection between minimum wages and then using that as a standard, no? In the kind of wages that they offer. So it might be the next part of the study, no? How do conglomerates determine these wages? And that seems to be a very interesting point. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Butch.
Thank you. So it's nice seeing you again.
So thank you, Mr. Felipe, for that great question. And thank you, Sir Butch, also for responding to that particular question. We now go to the Zoom chat, and we have a question from Mr. Gabriel Domingo. So I will read it. Hi, Dr. Lanzona. Great work. Could we explain why elasticity of labor supply is evidence for monopsony? Isn't monopsony the gap between wages and marginal products? Don't we need the marginal products to determine if it's monopsony? Example, monopsony if wage is less than MPL. In perfect competition, market level elasticity of supply of inputs can be small or large.
Yes. I think Gabby was my student before. No? I don't know if I explained it in our class. I always explain these things in class, but the idea is that I suppose you're aware of the learner index. It's something based on that, no? So it's possible that the employers are able to mark down their wages below the marginal revenue product of the worker because the workers are not responding. I mean, they're willing to accept the wages as they're being offered. So the lower the wage elasticity, the greater the probability that these corporations would eventually determine the wages that are found, right? And they would mark it down. Okay, of course, if you complain about it, then it's possible that you might be getting a better bargain. But the idea is that with search costs being very high and there's limited options available, then you're faced with this problem. Actually, even in developed countries, it has also been found that the labor supply is inelastic, wage inelastic, no? Although the values are a little bit higher than what I'm getting, no? So it seems to be a much more serious problem here in the Philippines. Because in the other developed countries, it's around 0.6 or 0.5. But in our case, for the males, no, it's around 0.14. So it's a little bit problematic in the Philippines. Yes. I hope I answered the question.
So thank you, Sir Domingo, for that question. Thank you, Sir Butch, as well, for responding to that particular question. Again, to our Zoom participants, if you want to ask, you can raise your hand so that I can call you. You can also put your question in the Zoom chat, and to our participants in Facebook, you can put your question in the comment section. We go back to the Zoom chat as we have a comment from Ms. Jean Ilo. Hi, Dr. Butch. Interesting extension of your respond paper regarding social protection. What is also important is the state providing support services for unpaid care and domestic work. So maybe Sir Butch, you would want to reply to that particular comment.
Yeah, actually, the person who pushed me to do this kind of study was Jean. So thank you, Jean, for that. Yeah, actually, we did discuss this already. So the idea is that, of course, the household might need some extra money, even if the husband is working. But at the same time, the women are expected to stay at home. So if in case that there's a need to have higher earnings, they will probably be forced to work, even if the wages are lower. No? So providing some kind of cash transfer, conditional cash transfer for women might be a solution to this income problem. You need to smoothen out the consumption. So it's possible that they might want to work in alternative contracts, but apparently the wages might not be very high. So the tendency then is that they will accept work even at a lower amount, as long as they could get, smoothen out their consumption patterns, and in the process, it's a companies who actually gain from that.
If
Thank
I
you,
may
Jean.
follow up on that, I do not
Yeah.
know how to do the raise hands. Sorry.
Yes, ma'am. Floor is yours.
Yes, Jean.
Floor is
I'm
yours.
Jean Ilio, and because I have friends, I've been friends for a long time. Uh, no, the question I asked is it's not actually, it need not necessarily be in terms of wages, but in terms of releasing women from the time that they spend on unpaid care and domestic work. I feel very strongly about that because it's my present advocacy. And so, because the state can provide different care infrastructure that
Yeah.
will release women actually from part of their time from unpaid care, domestic work, which will enable them to make more viable choices. Ano ba
Yeah.
talaga? Okay?
Uh,
And I would also like to point out while I have the floor uh, that much of the, sometimes I tease my economist friends. You work with figures. We because I'm also an economist as well as sociologist and anthropologist, we like to hear what people have to say. And a lot of the surveys actually done on women engaged in own account work or part of the alternative work is that they would prefer any work that will not bring them away, take them away from home. So it's just like that you may probably want to cross refer.
yeah.
You actually make explanations with existing surveys on career choices or economic enterprise choices.
Yeah.
Thank you, Woods. That's a
Yeah.
very interesting paper.
Okay. Actually, if there's some support in terms of giving them time, then that will allow the women to engage more in search, so that the search cost would be actually be lower.
Yeah.
So there's a possibility now that the wages that they'll be getting would be more reflective of their actual capabilities. Yeah.
I
So
would,
that could help. Apart from giving them exactly money,
yeah,
which will
yeah.
allow them to stay at home and at the same time, be able to smoothen out consumption. There could be some amount of some support in terms of providing them with some time so that they could search. They could be able to have more options. So that could be important as well.
I need, sorry
Yeah.
for, I don't see questions in the chat box. So I'm chatting with Butch. I wanted your take on this. When I presented part of your findings with the Philippine Competition Commission, because they just pay attention to competition-related problems with regards to the products market.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I asked them, don't you look at also the factors market or the inputs market? Or let's say in the
Yeah.
case of monopsony, does who do you think it is something that PCC, Philippine Competition Commission can look at, or is it principally only the
Output.
Department of Labor and Employment?
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, the initial literature on monopsony sort of links monopoly with monopsony, that if there's a large company in a particular town, then they're mostly the employer. But the more modern version is saying that even if the market is competitive, there could be some monopoly existing as well. No? So even if you have many firms producing the same products or different products, but once the firms begin to realize that women or the males have very limited options, it's very costly to do some search, they could engage in monopsony. No? So the whole idea is to, of course, there's still those elements there. No? The large corporations, the monopolies are still there, and that explains why both male and female seems to be affected by the monopsony. No? But in addition to that, there could be other factors as well. That's what I'm trying to mention in the paper.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you, Butch.
especially for the women.
Yeah, I'll stop talking now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jean. We'll discuss some more later.
Yeah. That's all. Okay.
So thank you, Ma'am Jean, for those additional questions and comments, and also thank you, Sir Butch, for responding to those as well. So I'm looking at the chat. It appears that we don't have any further questions. So may I request the admin of the economics department to please share the screen again as we proceed with the rest of the program. And again, thank you, Sir Butch, for
Thank
sharing
you.
your insights on your topic. So we would like to invite everyone to our next economics webinar, CGE Simulation of the Impacts of Climate Disasters on the Cities of Naga and Iloilo. And our speaker for that webinar will be Mr. Rolly Zar Joseph T. Castillo, lecturer of the Department of Economics, Ateneo de Manila University. This will be on November 9, Wednesday, 10 a.m. And we would like to invite everyone to visit our website for materials from previous seminars. And we invite you as well to visit us in the various social media platforms where we are available. So we are in Facebook, we are in Instagram, we are in Twitter, and we are also present in YouTube.